We rely on the responses made to vaccines to protect all of us from disease, but particularly those who, if exposed, would be unable to mount a response. So to do that, we want to make sure that our vaccines are going to produce the greatest possible immune response that is still safe for a person to experience. So something I always think of is that people often say, I don't get the flu shot because it makes me sick. Now, I kind of dislike that statement. And I'm not going to go into all of the ends of it now. But one of the things that I think people misunderstand is that it's not that the flu shot is actually making you sick. It's making you feel sick. But the way you know that it's not actually making you sick is because you're not sick for as long. You don't feel that way for as long. So any of you who have taken immunology with me know that the way we feel when we feel sick is actually a result of cytokine responses, right? Cytokines are what make us feel bad. Cytokines induce fever, and cytokines induce myalgia and arthralgia. And cytokines can make us just kind of feel bad in general. So, I take my son to go get a vaccination, and, the next morning he says, Mommy, I don't feel so good. And the immunologist in me goes, I know, baby, I'm so proud of you and your immune response. And I know that is the wrong response to have as a mother. But I say it anyway. But I also then, like, go and get Tylenol. But either way, it's cytokines that are actually doing this. So we want to boost this response. I want people to be proud of their immune responses, because that's good. When you're making a good immune response to a vaccine, it means that you responded. You now have a strong memory pool that's going to help you fight off this pathogen if you see it. And this is the other thing that I try to keep in mind when thinking about why we need to boost immunogenicity. If this rectangle, or yeah, I guess it's a rectangle, not so great at geometry, is everyone who received the vaccine. Okay. This is the percentage of people that will actually respond to that vaccine. Okay. So for a given vaccine, we want about 90% of the population to make a strong immune response. And that's kind of what we mean when we say, like, the vaccine rate that we need to maintain herd immunity. It's how many people in the population we absolutely need to be vaccinated, because we know right off the bat that even if we vaccinated the entire population, at least 10% are not going to make a response, because for whatever reason, they don't see the antigens the same way you and I do. Now, we aren't without tricks. Immunologists have a couple things up their sleeves that we can use to kind of boost the immune response. And I'm going to go through those now. Okay, the first thing is really, how can we actually think about route of administration? Okay, so if we think about the route of administration of vaccines, we know that there's pretty much two that people use the most: intramuscular and oral. All right. If we're dealing with a viral vaccines, especially if it's a live vaccine, these guys are going to replicate. And when they replicate, they're going to travel to the nearest lymph node, where they're going to encounter a whole bunch of immune cells. And those immune cells are actually going to propagate the responses systemically. So for that reason, if you have a live vaccine, the route of administration is not as important as if you have a subunit or an attenuated vaccine. Because when you have an inactive or a subunit vaccine, these guys aren't going to replicate. They're incapable of replicating. So if they can't replicate, we need to do something to increase their immunogenicity. Particularly for some of the subunit vaccines, we've already kind of handicapped ourselves, right? Because for many of the subunit vaccines, we're actually talking about vaccines that are only polysaccharides. And polysaccharides can't be seen by T cells. Why? T cells only see peptides. So if T cells are only seeing peptides, then T cells will not make a response to these polysaccharide vaccine. So we need to come up with another way for them to see that. So there's actually a couple of good ways to see it. The most important of which is actually conjugation. So conjugation is literally when I take something that is not very immunogenic, like a polysaccharide, and I pair it with something that is very immunogenic, like a peptide. This happens all the time. So a great example of this is like your Tdap or DTaP vaccines. DTaP, I already wrote that backward. But your Tdap and DTaP vaccines, which basically have toxoid and polysaccharides conjugated together. So what we find is that when we actually vaccinate for all of these together, you actually get a stronger immune response than if you tried to vaccinate with these separately. Another example of this would be like the MMRV, which is your measles, mumps, rubella, and varicella vaccine. We're actually vaccinating against 4 different pathogens here, and we're seeing a stronger response. So conjugation is literally the increased immunogenicity of polysaccharide vaccines can be achieved by basically chemically linking the polysaccharide to a protein. I think the best example of this would actually be your strep pneumo vaccines. So we have one vaccine that contains 23 of the polysaccharides, but no peptide. And then we have another vaccine that contains 13 polysaccharides, but is also conjugated to a basically diphtheria toxin analog. So basically it's a peptide that looks exactly like diphtheria toxin, but isn't. So in conjugating it here, we're actually kind of like falsely stimulating the T cells. And when we do that, we provide B cell help, which means we make some IgGs. And then we're able to respond and make IgG to these now polysaccharide antigens, okay? But if we didn't have this conjugation, then this wouldn't happen. So to the 23-valent PPSV, we only make IgM. Without the T cell help, you don't get past IgM. So that's kind of how conjugation works, is that we're literally just kind of falsely tricking the T cells into responding to something that they wouldn't normally respond to, or at least providing help, because the only kind of help they're providing is cytokine, but we're at least providing cytokine help to the developing immune response. Okay, the other option is adjuvants. Adjuvants come under a lot of fire. Basically, adjuvants are agents designed to boost stimulation of the immune response. Their whole job is to kind of stir up trouble. And they do this by enhancing antigen presentation. That's the whole goal of them. So they basically make the antigen presenting cells better at their job. They also increase co-stimulation. And if you remember your kind of introduction to immunology, co-stimulation is what leads to priming of T cells. So by increasing co-stimulatory molecules, you increase the amount of T cells that can be primed. The adjuvants can roughly be split into 2 categories. They can be basically made into a delivery category or an immune modulator category. So one is really going to ramp up the response, and the other is going to ramp up the response by increasing efficiency of delivery. So delivery would be something that basically prolongs how long an antigen can be found at the vaccination site. So how long does this stick around for T cells to come and interact with it? because if it's going to stay around, more dendritic cells will be recruited, and that extends to the duration of T and B cells. Immune modulators, on the other hand, basically induce differentiation and activation signals to monocytes, macrophages, and DCs. So basically, it's going to encourage more of these guys to differentiate so that we have more available to increase basically the amount of cells that are capable of antigen presentation and capable of providing co-stimulation. Aluminum salts are kind of the main one that people think of when they think of adjuvants. There are other ones, but that's kind of the main one that people think of.